Do you think the federal government is too big? Are you shocked at the level of waste and abuse of your tax dollars? Would you like to see the government shrink? Well, stay tuned because we're going to talk about that next. Hello, and welcome to the Chaplain's Corner After Hours, a place to discuss stories the mainstream media ignores that can actually impact our Christian walk and our spiritual journey. Chaplain Warren and Chaplain Nan are your hosts, and we're glad to have you with us. Hello, and welcome back to the Chaplain's Corner After Hours. I'm your host, Chaplain Warren.
And I'm Chaplain Nan.
And we're going to talk about something today that really affects all Americans, but in particular bears heavily on all Christians. And that subject is the size of the federal government. Now, perhaps your first thought about this is, well, how does that affect me in my day-to-day life? And I'd be tempted to say, are you kidding? But instead, I'll give you an example and leave it at that. Do you remember COVID? Do you remember when your church was shut down during COVID? Uh-huh. And although it may have been your local police, or maybe your city council, or both, that strong-armed your church to shut down under some kind of a threat, the truth of the matter is, the real pressure for that came from the unelected bureaucrat, Anthony Fauci.
Boo!
And all his leftist activists who threatened both state and local governments and health authorities to get them to toe the federal government line. And the purpose of bringing all this up is that don't you think for a moment they won't do it again if they get back in power.
So I just want to make this note.
Yes.
The unelected bureaucrats have never left power. They are still running the government.
Very good.
The only people that change places, kind of like at a tennis match, it's not the people that run the ball game. It's the people that play the ball game, otherwise known as the politicians. Mm-hmm. They just switch seats. Mm-hmm. Everybody that you're going to be talking about or that you just mentioned, they're still there unless Mr. Maha, RFK Jr., got rid of them. Otherwise, they're still there making rules for the next thing.
Well, that's a really good point because, if you watch the news, basically every week, every other week or something like that, you'll see a story where, the FBI fired 10 more deep-seated leftists who were involved in the raid on Mar-a-Lago or something like that. Or the DOJ has fired 3 more attorneys generals in states because, they found out they were leftists. So yes, that's a very good point. And so that helps to make the point of the question, which is, so what size should the federal government be? Now, there's going to be a whole variety of answers or opinions on what the answer to that question is. But one way to answer that question is, how about if the federal government was the size to carry out the duties which are delegated to it in the Constitution?
The what?
Yeah, the Constitution, the founding document. And so you might ask, what are those duties that are delegated to the federal government in the Constitution? Well, I'm glad you asked. Those duties are specified in Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution, and they focus on these following things. Things like declaring war, maintaining the military, coining money, taxing to support the government and its constitutional duties, regulating interstate and foreign commerce, which has historically been very important, and then managing immigration. Oh, that's a subject in the news right now. And then finally, ensuring the faithful execution of federal laws. And of course, federal laws are supposed to be enacted by the House of Representatives and by the Senate. And when they enact a law, they send it to the president for his signature or for his veto. That's how it's supposed to work. And so if we really went back to the size of government as described by the Constitution, what would that government look like compared to the one that we have today? Well, I'm glad you asked. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a little video clip where we talk about what the government looks like today, specifically the executive branch, which really controls the majority of the bureaucracy of the government. We're going to look at the executive branch as it's laid out today, and then we're going to talk about what you could get rid of or what you might merge into other departments to slim that government down to something that looks more like what is specified in Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution. So we're going to jump into that video clip right now. Okay, so we may insert this following segment, so go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. So I thought that, as you said, part of the Article 1, 2, and 3 was the faithful execution of federal laws, which the lawmakers, which is elected officials, House of Representatives, and the Senate, they make the laws. And so I was under the understanding that by them getting some bright new idea for some new department or some new agency or some new law that needed to be dealt with, you had to have a bureaucracy, otherwise known as civil servants, otherwise known as the office workers, to make it happen. So that they fund it, and so they create it, and that's what keeps bloating it, because they just keep giving more and more money as somebody comes up with a new idea of how they can increase their department, or kind of like if you grow a business with taxpayer funds. They were just bloating it, getting all this money, which then they don't want to cut, because then you're out of money, you're out of power, and you're out of a job.
Well, that's true. The House of Representatives and the Senate, they're in charge of creating this legislation to implement some new function of government. So let's just take an example like the EPA. I don't remember the exact date, but somewhere around 1965 or so, legislation was passed and signed by, I guess, LBJ at that time to create the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, once it's an agency, it has to be managed by somebody. Okay, so the Congress does not have management function. The judiciary does not have management function. It's the President of the United States and the executive branch that has management function built into it. So all these departments like the EPA, and we just go down the list, they all end up in the executive branch. And so they're under the president's direct authority. And so that's why I say the executive branch is where the vast majority of the unelected bureaucracy sits and creates regulations, which I believe it was some Supreme Court decision later on, and listeners, correct me if I'm wrong. There was a Supreme Court decision, I believe, that said executive branch department regulations have the full effect of law. And so you have like the EPA creating all of these regulations, And when those regulations go out for public comment, and then when they're enacted after that period of public comment, they have the effect of law. Yet no elected representative of the people created those regulations. And so these executive departments just create regulations out of whole cloth, out of blue sky, and there's never any legislative intent in those. And that's how we get the government just grabbing up everything in the country and denying people freedom, because these unelected bureaucrats have the power to create law without legislative intent.
So the "you can't do this" or "you must do this" is not coming really from the lawmakers, the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, who we vote for. It's being made up by the office workers, if you will, of these departments, who decide this is going to be the rule. And so you can get arrested for it. You can actually lose your civil rights.
Oh, absolutely.
And be criminally charged, as we've seen many times over the past 10 years happen to people on ranches and farms. And
exactly. They
like the Amish dairy farmer.
Well, yes, and the Clean Water Act, which has been abused beyond all belief, such that a landowner who has a lake or a pond on their land can't do what they want with that pond because it's under the regulation of the federal government, under a regulation that no one in the House, no one in the Senate ever passed legislatively.
So when they do that, well, I guess you'll go into it later, but
why don't we go ahead and jump in and take a look at what the executive branch looks like and what it could look like if we ran it by the Constitution.
I was going to so the point that you're making would that be correct, that it was made by what happened in 2025 when we got a new president, Donald Trump, and a new cabinet who went in and slashed their offices and were slashing and making smaller different departments, including eliminating, or when Doge came in and was doing that U.S. aid thing of all these other things that they were cutting out. Those are all things that were under the executive branch, or those
Correct.
Things that were the House of Representatives and the Senate had put in place, and we were trying to slash it.
Correct. So over nearly 60 years of what's called the administrative state, the bureaucracies have exploded, the number of regulations has exploded, and the net result of this is the freedom that everyday citizens have has been eroded significantly without them having one chance to express a vote on any of it.
So is the Constitution, and maybe you'll get into it, is the Constitution stating what can't be done to take away, like to bar us from a freedom? In other words, the regulations that were keep being put in place are, I guess, under whoever is making them is believing that they're saving the planet over the rancher's right to have the water on his property and using the water on his property how he chooses to. Is the Constitution set up to protect him, so that, like, what government cannot do to him in order to safeguard his rights, or it's in order to safeguard, like, the country or the world's rights?
So
because that always seems to be the battle.
So the Constitution is a document that lays out the organization of the federal government, and then it describes what duties and powers the various branches of the government have. And Article 1, 2, and 3 have to do primarily, I guess, with the executive branch. Anyway, the point is all powers not delineated in the U.S. Constitution to the federal government are reserved to the states. And so what that means is if a particular power is not listed in the Constitution as something that the executive branch handles, the legislative branch handles, or the judicial branch handles, if it's not in there, then that power automatically is reserved to the states. And so a good example of that is there is absolutely nothing in the Constitution that talks about abortion. And so the Supreme Court just created abortion, the regulation of abortion, or the right of abortion, as just out of thin air. And so when Roe v. Wade was overturned, that power was taken away from the federal government because it's not in the Constitution. And so now that's why it goes back to all the separate states.
So each state decides whether to have it or not.
And how to regulate it and all that kind of stuff. And the crucial point of that is then the people in that state get to vote how they want that to be.
So back to your EPA example, which we're talking about. So if there's offices or departments that aren't in, that right now come under the executive branch, if it's not in the Constitution that they're supposed to do X, Y, and Z, like make sure every house has a windmill, just making a crazy example, but enforcing it, if you don't have a windmill, then that is deleted. And that is then given to the state, wherever that house is. They get to decide if a house needs to have a windmill. And if the people of that state think crazy, then they're not going to vote for it.
Exactly.
Is that kind of where you're going?
That's
okay.
it.
I think the remedial student, constitutional student is tracking it.
Okay. All right. So we're going to jump into that video, talk about the executive branch, and we'll be back in a few moments. So as we mentioned at the beginning of our episode, one way to reduce the size of the federal government would be to have it adhere to the original Constitution, specifically Articles 1, 2, and 3, which focus on declaring war, maintaining the military, coining money, taxing, regulating interstate and foreign commerce, managing immigration, and ensuring the faithful execution of federal laws which are made by the legislature. As we mentioned, most of the bulk of the bureaucracy belongs in the executive branch, which is the picture we have in front of us. This is the organization of the modern executive branch, because it's the executive branch that has the managing function within government. And so the President of the United States is beholden, in theory, to the Constitution, and the executive office of the President, which includes him and all of his staff, are, in theory, beholden to the Constitution. And under the President's executive office, you have all of these agencies which have been created, except for those in the beginning, which I think were the Department of Commerce, Department of Agriculture, and the Department, it was called the Department of War. This picture is a little old because it calls it the Department of Defense, and it's now been renamed the Department of War. And so those were really the three agencies initiated at the founding of the government. The rest of what you see in front of you has been created by actions of Congress, and once created, to become the purview of the executive branch. We also have something called independent agencies and government corporations, which includes Fannie Mae, Fannie Mac, and I have no idea what else it may constitute. But anyway, as you look through these agencies, which contain, I think at the last count, it was what, 2.2, 2.4 million employees or something along that line. None of these
or very few of these, are specified as part of the Constitution. That doesn't mean that they don't carry out important duties, particularly in our modern country, but they don't, they're not part of the mandate of the Constitution. And so what's happened over the years is not only has the size of government grown, but the scope of what government puts its fingers into has grown. For example, we have the Department of Health and Human Services, which contains a whole conglomeration of sub agencies like the FDA, like Medicare, Medicaid, and there's probably some others that I'm not thinking of, which basically have served to federalize the whole business of medicine in our country. Uh, for people who are not 60 years or older, you can't remember back when medicine, doctors and hospitals and all of that were private businesses, or many hospitals were actually built by and founded by churches as kind of nonprofit businesses. And that was how medicine was run. And medicine at that time, given the technology it had, was good, it was available, and everybody virtually could afford it. If you couldn't afford it, a church typically would help you out with that. There is nothing in the Constitution about a Department of Education. There is nothing in the Constitution about a Department of Energy, which, by the way, that term, the Department of Energy, always kills me every time I look at it, because the Department of Energy has not ever produced 1 watt of energy. So it's amazing. Anyway, so as we look at this modern organization, we can ask the question, what if we rearranged this or reorganized it along the lines of Articles 1, 2, and 3? Well, if we were to set out to do that, here's what it might look like.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. So we have this agency called the White House, and the White House, why couldn't it just be slid over here into the Office of Management and Budget? I can't believe that there isn't some overlap between these two. The U.S. Trade Representative, what exactly do we need that for? And then environmental quality, that is not in the Constitution. Science and technology, drug control policy, none of that is in the Constitution. And remember what we said before, just because these things are not powers that are delegated to the federal government doesn't mean that, well, what it does mean is powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved for the states. And so the states could work on drug control policy.
So does that mean that if it's not in the original Constitution, which right now the chart we're looking at has just a couple of boxes available to be under the guise of how the Constitution was written, if they're not in there, then the states need to be responsible for those things?
Either that, or there's another alternative, and that would be to set up a private corporation to handle regulations which are laws which Congress has passed. For example, in the Department of Health and Human Services, we mentioned that the FDA, Federal Drug Administration, is a part of this. And the Federal Drug Administration is in charge of monitoring our medicines, monitoring new medicines that are coming out, and making sure they pass safety protocols before being released into the public. Well, that function can be a standalone private business to administer the regulations which Congress has passed. It doesn't have to be a department of the federal government. And it wouldn't work as a state department because then each state would have different regulations and it'd be difficult for drug companies to follow 50 different state regulations on drugs. But it could be a private corporation, which would probably be more effective, more efficient, and less costly than a massive bureaucracy in the federal government. The Department of Treasury, that's enumerated in the Constitution. Department of Veteran Affairs probably could be moved over to the Department of Defense. That would seem to make a lot of sense. The Department of Commerce, Department of Agriculture could be merged together because there's a lot of overlap with these folks. Department of Transportation could be merged with the Department of the Interior. There's a lot of overlap there. Department of Justice works with the third branch of the government. Department of Labor works with Commerce. It could either stay a standalone agency or it could go to the Department of Commerce. And all these independent agencies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they can disappear. We have a massive banking system that handles mortgages just fine. It's hard to understand why these exist, other than they end up being political pawns. So not to belabor this too much, if we went through and did this, here's what the reorganized executive branch could look like. You'd have the Office of Management and Budget. These two should have been merged. This one, Department of State, moves to the Department of Defense. This disappears. Treasury stays. You know, the Department of Veteran Affairs probably could have moved this up here and we could have blanked this out also. But what you see is we went from 21 separate boxes here in the original slide to now we're down to 9. And some of these functions like education rightfully belong at the state level. Energy policy probably belongs at the state level. If some states want to go, bananas on solar panels, go for it. If you want to go bananas on windmills, go for it. If you don't want those things, then you're going to outlaw those things. That should be a state by state agency or decision. And then the Department of Health and Human Services, as far as FDA, as far as Medicare, Medicaid, these could be independent agencies. And by making those independent private agencies, it would get the federal government out of the business, out of the medical business, which would probably do wonders in terms of cost reductions and better health care. Because a lot of regulations coming out of the Medicare and Medicaid agencies and the Obamacare rules really limit competition in the medical field. And we know that when competition is limited, service levels go down and costs go up. Department of Treasury stays the same. Department of Labor could maybe moved into Department of Commerce, or could be created as a separate private agency to administer payroll rules, pension rules, and those other kinds of regulations.
Question. So
Yes.
if it becomes an agency versus under the executive office of the president, then who would that agency be under? The Congress? The legislative branch?
Well, the legislative branch would promulgate the regulations for a particular part of the economy, a particular industry, and then this private company, it would be their job to make sure that companies involved in that area were adhering to the regulations. And if for some reason they weren't doing their job, the separate states could sue that private entity. And certainly the Congress, with its investigatory powers, could investigate those private companies. Uh, so, I'm not going to claim that this would be perfection and that it wouldn't be difficult to enact, but the point would be that it would take us back closer to operating under the original intent of the Constitution.
So another question, and maybe that's for a different podcast, is in the same way with the chart we're looking at was so massively, you know, exponentially grew under the executive branch, which
There you
gave the
go.
president those authorities to have all these different literal cabinet members who then have their own standalone departments. Is that the same thing for the legislative branch? Do they have as many, departments like that?
Well,
Or is it totally set up different than what I'm looking at?
the legislative branch has a very clear mandate, and that's to create legislation, to become aware of problems, issues from its constituents, and then to enact laws to correct what's wrong or to create new laws to handle new situations or to bring new opportunities to the country, that type of thing. Now, the legislative branch has grown enormously also, but kind of by a different dynamic. The original Congress
Mm-hmm.
was part-time.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
They
That's
would
on
meet, I don't know,
track.
three months a year or something like that. And then they all went home back to their home
Their
states
regular
and their
jobs.
regular jobs.
Kind of like state legislators.
Yeah, but at some point, and I can't remember when, I bet it's somewhere around the First World War or something like
Yeah.
that. At some point, they became full time. Well, when they became full time, then they needed
To fill that
staff,
time.
and they needed more staff. And and once they became full time, they were all trapped in Washington, D.C. And so it's a dream come true for lobbyists. All they got to do is move to Washington, D.C., and they can spend all day chasing these folks. If these folks were going back to their homes, their 50 states, for half the year, the lobbyists would have to go back and chase them there.
And try and get them there.
Yeah.
I had another question. So if put the chart up of what it looks like if it goes back to its original source.
Oh, well, it's this one.
No, the original Constitution.
Okay.
When
There we go.
So if it goes back to that under the executive branch,
Uh-huh.
does that mean that, and I don't know how to say this clearly, but would that disempower the president of the United States from all the authority and power that that office has right now in the country? Would that like AT's word, chop him off at the knees, and that it would really make him a lot smaller in his or her ability versus the legislative branch and the judicial branch. Not really the judicial branch, because they've pretty, I think, stayed pretty constrained in what they do. But would that make it like a less powerful office than what it is now versus the power of the legislature?
Well, I guess you could say the president could be less powerful, but not along the lines of the things that the Constitution says he should do, which is to defend the country. He's commander in chief, affect the treasury and how that affects the economy. The thing that we've seen over the our lifetimes is like the environmental agency, environmental quality, the EPA, that has become a massive political football under under Obama. It became the green energy thing. Under Biden, it became electric vehicles and nothing else. And the original mandate of the Environmental Protection Agency was not that. It was simply to monitor water and air quality. But over the years, various presidents with various agendas were able to expand and distort that mandate to the point where it became an agency where, you know, we're going to do away with the traditional automobile. We're going to, and you're only going to be able to buy this. And nowhere in the Constitution was there any hint that the president had that much power.
So back to the powers vested into all these different departments of what you're saying, the bureaucrats who run those departments, not the elected official, the president of the United States, but they're really under him.
Mhm.
But they kind of made their own government.
So
Like they
all,
say that when we hear on the news that bureaucrats have made a fourth branch of the government that's unelected, and they've made their own regulations which carry criminal penalties, which means your civil rights, your right to freedom, you can be jailed, you can debanked. And if you don't know what the word debanked is, look it up, Google it. There's plenty going on. If that is so, then couldn't the president then just fire these people and shut it down? Why can't he do that?
well, the problem is, I mean, he can try to fire them, but the problem is these agencies were set up with various mandates. And there was a Supreme Court decision, and I can't remember when it is. I hope one of our listeners can comment on that. But basically, a Supreme Court decision that said the regulations these agencies write have the full effect of law. And so what's happened since the really it was started in the mid 60s under Lyndon Johnson, what's happened is we have an explosion of laws that were never legislatively promulgated.
So they weren't written or they're not made up and voted on and
Correct.
done by the people we elect to go up to Congress
Correct.
and the Senate.
Correct.
They're made by people who are
Totally unelected bureaucrats.
bureaucrats, otherwise known as civil servants,
I guess you could call them
or
that.
people that aren't elected, maybe that
They're just not
who
elected.
work for
Right.
the government. They can make up laws
Right.
that nobody has any say about.
Correct. Correct.
Wow.
Yes. And so, I mean, one of the well, the two most egregious are the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the Department of Education, who have both just run roughshod with all kinds of rules and mandates and whatnot that are not only totally unconstitutional, but, you know, in the case of the Department of Education, patently immoral. And actually, EPA also. The EPA created a set of rules and regulations called the Clean Water Act, which originally had dealt with, you know, the clean water for human consumption and
How's that
taking
working out in Detroit?
and taking care, you know, and regulating industries to reduce pollution and things like that certifiably harm the environment. But they went absolutely nuts. And so if you're a landowner out in the West and you have a lake or a pond on your land, you can't do anything with that lake or pond without going through the EPA because that they expanded the mandate to the point where a water puddle after a rain shower falls under the Clean Water Act.
I bet they don't care what happens in the swamps of Louisiana.
Well,
Gator country.
I don't know. Anyway,
I'm just joking, Pete.
so anyway, I don't want to belabor this, but just wanted to make the point that if we want to talk about reducing the size of government, one way to do that is think about what does the Constitution enumerate as powers for the federal government.
So I have one last question.
All right.
In your lifetime, since you were old enough to vote in 1800s, since you've been able to vote, how many presidents have said and or tried to do just what you're talking about?
One,
And who was that?
Donald Trump. Uh, and actually, let me add to that. Actually, one president way before my lifetime, and I think it was Warren G. Harding.
Oh yeah, you talked about
As we talked about in the rest of the episode, actually did do this. He saw the nation heading into a recession, so he cut the size of the federal government by about a third, cut spending that much, and the result for the economy was like a shot in the arm, and basically that led to the Roaring Twenties.
we need the roaring 2026s.
Well, we need to have the backbone to get back to closer to what the Constitution mandated for the federal government and for the state governments. Okay?
Amen, brother.
Thank you. Now back to the rest of the episode.
Okay, so, okay, this is after the video. 1, 2, 3, go. And so as you can see from the video, we went from 21 separate agencies in the executive branch, plus all the miscellaneous ones, down to 9 agencies, 9 separate agencies, and getting rid of all the independent agencies and government corporations like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and who knows what else. A strategic question is would cuts like that cause heart attacks in D.C.?
You betcha.
You betcha. I mean, just look at the relatively modest reductions the Trump administration has tried to put in, and you'd think the world was coming to an end.
Protest.
Exactly. But here's the most important question. Would everyday Americans going about their lives notice any difference? And I think the correct answer is probably not anything critical. I mean, they might notice a difference, but not anything critical to their lives, because just as we were talking about before the video, things that might be cut, like the welfare, federal government welfare, federal government food stamp program, things like that. Those are Medicaid. Those are programs that would be picked up by the states to administer as best for each state. Now, tax dollars might flow from the federal government just like they do today to help the states, but the states would be on their own in terms of deciding how they want to run those programs based on what their citizens want. And so you get away from this one-size-fits-all type of situation, and you really get rid of the intense lobbying that goes on in Washington, D.C., because now lobbyists, instead of living in the outskirts of D.C. and spending their whole day in the halls of Congress getting what they want, they'd have to travel around to 50 states to lobby all those legislators. So in that way, the programs that people really want, they would get through the state now instead of through the federal government. Perhaps the most important thing people might notice is they might be able to keep more of their hard-earned money because the federal government would be so much smaller than it is now. And because a lot of these issues would go back to the states, the citizens would then have more direct control over what government does to them in their lives.
Was it ever like that? Was our country ever like that?
It was in the beginning, very much so in the beginning. So much so that I think it was the War of 1812 or something like that. There were serious questions of whether we had enough money as a federal government to enter the war. And so yeah, it was like that. And then I believe it was under the Harding administration. I could be wrong about that, but I think it was Harding that saw that the country was dipping into a recession, and he literally cut the size of the federal government by a third. And that so energized the economy that it in part led to the roaring 1920s.
Wow.
Yeah, and so, and under Ronald Reagan, there weren't. I don't think really that
He never really cut
he
anything.
never really cut anything. But what he did do, he cut the income tax rates. He slashed them,
Right. He gave people their money.
gave people their money back, which made the economy explode, and which actually increased the tax revenue because of the far greater output of goods and services. So anyway. None of this is going to be easy to do. Certainly, Donald Trump has tried hard, but he's had a tough row of it. But it's something that's worth fighting for because freedom is worth fighting for. And so we'd like to hear any comments you have to make about this. Chaplain Ann, do you have anything to finish up with?
I'm still trying to figure out Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. So those of you who are a little bit dazed right now, just think about the things that maybe would make your life easier if you didn't have to comply and be part of it or do something with your money that you could do for your family or your own self that is going, far away into the garbage can, the armpit. Well, I don't want to say that because the government does do a lot of good things. And
Yep.
I would like to make this one caveat. I do believe, I could be wrong, but I contend, those of you who are bureaucrats or have bureaucrats whom you love, who work for the government, 99% of them are good, honest, patriotic Americans doing service work for their country, getting a paycheck, taking care of what they have to take care of. And so I would just say there's, the bad apples always are the ones that show up and make things a mess, and then everybody else has to pay the consequence for it. So we're not making a blanket statement about people who do their service by being civil servants and working for the government that keeps our country safe, running smoothly, better than any other place you could visit. See how many people who left because of our new president are now returning to the country because it was so bad where they went to. I guess that's my little caveat announcement.
Okay. And on that note, until next time, be blessed. Thank you for being with us today. Just remember, God is in control, and we know how the story ends.